Good evening, everyone. I'm Tony Marks. I'm the president of the New York Public Library. Thank you all for being here and those watching online. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to one of the highlights of the year, the Live from New York annual live from NYPL. Not Saturday night. The annual Robert B. Silvers Lecture. We have been proudly presenting this event in partnership with the New York Review of Books for more than 20 years, since 2002. The longevity of this series is a testament not only to the deep and abiding relationship the library had with the man it is named for, but also with the remarkable publication and its editorial vision that he stewarded for decades. Bob was, of course, a library lion, a trustee, a huge advocate and protector of the New York Public Library, and a friend. We all continue to miss him. It's therefore so fitting that the library acquired Bob's life work in the form of the archives of the New York Review. 3,000 linear feet came to us in 2015, and it is basically the intellectual history of the last 50 years and counting. The library continues to collect, and the Review and its archive continue to be at the center of that collecting. Note the most recent major acquisition, of course connected to the New York Review, so essentially the archive we recently acquired of Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn. So the relationship continues. I'm going to turn things over to the woman who is shepherding the New York Review of Books into the future, its editor, Emily Greenhouse. She is the first woman and the youngest ever editor of the Review. This is the magazine's 60th year. Happy birthday. And we know that it is in the best of hands with Emily moving us forward and continuing to give so much for us to digest and read and learn from. I just want to say, I'll let Emily do the introductions for Sherrilyn, except I want to say Sherrilyn is a hero of mine. I think I am not alone in that. I know I'm not. She is a true justice warrior and has been for a lifetime at a moment in which that is so essential. She has stood in and walked in so eloquently, so powerfully, the shoes of Thurgood Marshall. And when you see Sherrilyn's shoes tonight, you'll know how fabulous that absolutely is. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming first Emily Greenhouse.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tony. It's really an honor to be here. I remember being an assistant and helping Bob carry his bag backstage. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Public Library. My name is Emily Greenhouse, and I'm the editor of the New York Review of Books. It is my honor to be here this evening to introduce the brilliant and innovative lawyer and scholar Sherrilyn Ifill, a distinguished contributor to the New York Review, who will deliver the 2023 Robert B. Silvers Lecture, How America Ends and Begins Again. This annual lecture series was endowed by the philanthropist and computer pioneer Max Palevsky in 2002, in recognition of the work of Robert B. Silvers, who co-founded the New York Review of Books in 1963 with Barbara Epstein. The series features contemporary writers, scholars, artists, and business leaders whose fields correspond to the broad range of Mr. Silvers, Bob's to many of us, interest in literature, the arts, politics, economics, history, and the sciences. Previous Silvers lecturers have included, among others, Joan Didion, Oliver Sacks, Zadie Smith, Lori Moore, Alma Guillermo Prieto, Henry Louis Gates and Andrew Curran last year, and Nicholas Kristof, to name just a few. In addition to his dedication to his work at the Review and the many writers with whom he worked closely over the years, Mr. Silvers was a steadfast supporter of the New York Public Library. He served on the library's Board of Trustees and in 2014 was named a Library Lion, an honor bestowed upon him for his tremendous contribution to the world of letters. Given his long-standing reverence for this institution, it is fitting to gather at the library in honor of his memory as we celebrate the continuation of his legacy. A couple of quick program notes. We encourage you to help yourselves to a current issue of the New York Review of Books. Copies are available by the door through which you entered. Following the lecture, assuming we have time, Sherrilyn will be happy to answer some questions from the audience. If you're in the room and wish to ask a question, please write it down on the handy note cards you find on your seats. One of the library's wonderful staff members will come around to collect them. If you're watching online, please type your question directly into the chat or send it via email at publicprograms@nypl.org. That's publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll get to as many questions as we can. A personal request, if you can please keep your questions brief and inquisitive. Without further ado, Sherrilyn Ifill is a civil rights lawyer and scholar. From 2013 to 2022, she served as the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF, the country's premier civil rights law organization fighting for racial justice and equality. She currently serves as a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. She has also, in my tenure as editor of the New York Review, become a frequent and hugely admired contributor to our pages. Ifill began her career as a fellow at the American Civil Liberties Union before joining the staff of the LDF as an assistant counsel in 1988. There, she litigated voting rights cases for 5 years. In 1993, Ifill left LDF to join the faculty at University of Maryland School of Law in Baltimore. Over 20 years, Ifill taught civil procedure and constitutional law to thousands of law students and pioneered a series of law clinics, including one of the earliest law clinics in the country, focused on challenging legal barriers to the reentry of ex-offenders and a clinic on reparations. In 2008, she published On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, an extraordinary book which is credited with laying the foundation for contemporary conversations about lynching and reconciliation. A 10th anniversary edition of the book was recently released with a foreword by Brian Stevenson, another extraordinary New York Review contributor, the acclaimed lawyer and founder of the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. As the president and director counsel of the LDF, Ifill did much to shape our national conversation about race and civil rights. She led the organization in groundbreaking litigation in the areas of voting rights, economic justice, and education, and took a prominent role in confronting police violence against unarmed Black people. In 2021, Time magazine named her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Ifill is a recipient of the Radcliffe Medal, the Brandeis Medal, the Thurgood Marshall Award from the American Bar Association, and the Gold Medal from the New York State Bar Association. She was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. Ifill serves on the board of the Mellon Foundation, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the board of the Learning Policy Institute, and the board of trustees of New York University School of Law. We're very, very honored that she's here with us tonight and that she contributes to the New York Review. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium Sherrilyn Ifill.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sometimes when you do these things, you're kind of in your own space and then you forget. And so I just try to take a picture of what it feels like to have people do this. Thank you so, so very much. And it's thrilling to see everyone here. I am really so honored to have been invited to give the Robert Silvers Lecture this year. It means really a great deal to me. in fact, beginning last year, as Emily indicated, I've had the honor of publishing a few pieces in the New York Review of Books. And I have to tell you, for this simple girl from Queens, it always feels like an honor to be in the pages of this extraordinary journal. The team at the Review are just really wonderful. I would say the most positive editing experience of my life has been working with the team at the Review, including Emily Greenhouse and Max Nelson. And of course, I thank everyone who was involved in putting together this evening. I won't call all your names because I'm likely to get them wrong. But I thank you so much for making this night happen. I'm grateful to my friend Tony Marks for his elaborate remarks, which I always appreciate. And I'm really grateful to just be standing tonight in a public library. Yes. For me, New York girl from Queens, when I heard the news about potential library closings on weekends, it did something just incredibly powerful to me. I don't know how I would have made it, how I would have survived, had I not been able to spend Saturdays in the Paisley Park branch of the Queensborough Public Library growing up. I had lost my mom when I was very young. My father was super strict, and I loved books because I could escape into this world, and I wasn't really allowed to go anyplace else. The library was 3 blocks away, and I was allowed to go on my own, and I would go every Saturday. Sometimes my sister would come with me. I would take out 10 books and read them that week, and then I would come back the next Saturday and take out another 10 books. And well, this was everything for me. So just imagining closing off opportunities to children who need this, who need to escape into the worlds that books have to offer is really horrifying. And so I do want to say, because Tony Marks is too polite to say it, that you need to donate to the New York Public Library, because this is your resource. If you want to understand how we hold on to democracy, which I'll be talking about in a moment, one of the ways is to ensure that we have robust, healthy public institutions. And the library is one of the few remaining ones. And it is under siege all over this country. If you are lucky enough to have a public library system where you can take out books, where you don't have bans on books, where you can spend hours in the stacks, where you can research, where you can come in from the heat in the summer, you need to support it. I hope this moment shows us that even libraries are not institutions we can take for granted. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to see all of you here, but I would ask you to come up off of some money for the public library. I also want to make sure I thank the late Robert Silvers for co-creating a publication that's maintained such a high standard of excellence, and that has allowed those of us for whom books are church, lover, parent, friend, the opportunity to explore books and film and theater through reviews written by some of our best authors. I heard someone say you could pick up copies of the New York Review of Books. That's like a precious thing. So, like, you know how you walk past things at these talks? No, you want to get a copy and maybe 2, and have it on your coffee table, and every time you feel like reading something really interesting, pick it up, because it's a wonderful treat. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming, either in person or on the live stream tonight. I have some friends who are here, my best friend who's always in the first row, and her husband. She and I were law school classmates and have remained intensely close friends for, gosh, 35 or so years. And glad to see her here, another Queens girl. Did you spend a lot of time in the library? I don't think so. You were allowed to go places. Okay, anyway, so now a brilliant law professor at Fordham Law School. I didn't mean any slight by that, I'm just saying. Thank you for being here. And to everyone who is listening on live stream as well. It's a beautiful night tonight in New York and up and down the East Coast. And so I'm painfully aware that you could be out at dinner or at home drinking a glass of wine, enjoying this evening. And instead you chose to spend the evening listening to a lecture with a very ominous sounding title. I want to make sure you can make it home in time for whatever game is on or for the new episode of Ted Lasso or whatever. So I'm going to jump right in. How America Ends and Begins Again. I chose this title for my talk because I have been driven these days to speaking in more direct terms than I had been accustomed to. And I think you came tonight because you understand and share the sense of urgency I feel about this moment in our country. We don't have the luxury of niceties and illusions. We have been driven to face hard truths about our republic, about our political system, about our neighbors, about our safety, our understanding of who we are, about our past, and what our future may be. We are, as a country, in a moment of existential crisis. As I have said often over the past 2 years, there is no guarantee we will make it out of this crisis as a democracy. I fear sometimes that far too many people, especially in places like New York, do not understand that it is possible that we will continue as a nation, but not as a democracy. If, like me, you have represented over many decades people who live in Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi and Baltimore, you know that this can be true. It is possible for our country to no longer be a democracy, but for you and I to still go to the movies, visit the New York Public Library, drink good wine, go to the beach with our children and grandchildren, go shopping, and go to Yankee games. But what movies will be made? And whether there will be public libraries in broad swaths of this country, and whether in those libraries there will be books that open minds and hearts and spirits, or whether those libraries will be controlled by book police who keep lists of banned books and facilitate the arrest of librarians who waver from the approved state list of books, is the question. You may even be able to vote, but whether the results of those elections will be honored, whether election officials will be intimidated into providing results demanded by thugs masquerading as members of a political party, and whether you will be compelled to overcome obstacles to exercise your vote based on your race, is the question. You will be able to hang out with your kids and your grandkids, but will the decision about whether to have children be made by you or the state? Will your adult daughters be compelled to become mothers against their will, is the question. When you go to the movies or to a gathering like this, will you live every moment in terror of a mass shooter? Or will you, because of the rise of violent hate crimes based on your race or religion, will you decide not to come out and participate in public events like this? Will the actions of your elected representatives reflect the will of the people, or will your country be managed by reactionary theocrats or by white supremacists who have gerrymandered their way into the exercise of power far beyond their numbers? We live in a country that purports to be a democracy, but has abandoned ethics and norms of nonviolence and the rule of law. That is the question. Will you live in a secular democracy, or in a religious state, an authoritarian state, a kind of Potemkin democracy? And if the answer to that question, those questions, matter to you, if it's important to you to live in a true and healthy democracy, if you're willing to fight to live in such a democracy, then tonight I want to talk with you. If you're agnostic about whether we are a democracy, or if in fact you would prefer that we were governed by authoritarian or theocratic regimes, then you won't enjoy this talk, and I would welcome you to sign off now or quietly exit. I want those of you committed to living in a healthy democracy to face a truth, and that is that we are standing at a crossroads, and it's critical that we not turn away from it. The slide into authoritarianism will not affect us all equally, and that presents the opportunity for apathy, or may encourage some of us to give in to our exhaustion or disillusionment. But we cannot. We must not. Now, we can stagger our rest. Some of us can rest while others step up. Shore leave is good. Sometimes you have to step back from the front. But this can only be temporary in times like these, because the forces arrayed against us are too determined and too dangerous for us to give up. I feel a particular sense of urgency because I'm not just interested in how we endure, how we survive this moment, nor am I interested in a return to the former days, like people who say, can you believe the days when we had a black president? Or the 90s, or whatever period people have decided was Shangri-La for this country. Because, first of all, those periods are only better by comparison to the current moment. They had their problems. And because if you live and work from the lens that I do, then you know that mass incarceration, racism, wealth inequality, educational inequity, segregation, police brutality and misconduct, media bias have always been with us for the lifetime of the oldest person in this room, to be sure. So this is not something new. But to say this is not to deny that something monumental has happened to our country over the past 10 years. Many things have been broken. Much has been exposed. Lives have been lost. Lines have been crossed. Norms have been abandoned. Much has been released that cannot easily be contained. I mean, here we are in 2023 with tens of millions of Americans prepared to elect again as president a man of such degraded and immoral character, a man so void of a spirit of public service, a man so fundamentally inclined towards theft, mendacity, cruelty, and criminality that we can scarcely absorb the breadth of his transgressions in office, some of which were ruled on by a jury today. Now, if you feel uncomfortable right now with my having said this and you're wondering, hey, is this a partisan event? Then that's part of the problem. Because a democracy is made up of institutions and ideas that have nothing to do with partisan affiliation. I know this because I've been, despite my youthful appearance, as Tony Marx has said, a civil rights attorney for 30 years. And when I was first practicing, I was often suing Democrats. I've sued Democrats in voting rights cases. The governor of Louisiana is a Democrat. We just sued him 2 years ago. So I have worked in the nonpartisan space my entire career. But I have worked in the justice space, and I have worked in the democracy space. And I will not cede any of these powerful elements of truth, integrity, compassion, humanity to one party or another. Those are not partisan values. Those are human values and values that must be protected in a democracy. And if one party has chosen to walk away from those values, that's not my problem. I'm not going to not call it out for what it is, lest I be painted as a partisan. And I share this with you because I want you to think about how many times you have felt nervous about saying the things that must be said because you fear that you will be seen as entering a political space. But you are entering a space of democracy and protection of democracy. And that requires all of us to speak up, especially at this moment. We have seen the very notion of truth eroded. Truth is not partisan. Truth is truth. And 10 millions of our fellow country persons now live in a world of alternate facts, conspiracy theories, fear-mongering, and race baiting, and a world in which cruelty is normalized. For heaven's sakes, I've been part of conversations sometimes on social media, and you've seen it on televised media, in which we seem to be in a contested space about Nazis. When did we lose that consensus? Is that a partisan thing? Efforts to challenge public education, organized since the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education by white parents who resisted sending their children to school with black children and black teachers, have now taken a turn. and using manufactured cultural concerns about trans people and about what conservative extremists call woke ideology, plans are fully underway to dismantle public education and to transfer the billions of dollars that we invest, that every healthy democracy invests in our public school system, to schools that are, in essence, religious academies. In the name of parents' rights, extremists have engaged in an all-out assault on public schools as a place where young people can learn to embrace inclusivity, diversity, and principles of equality. They're creating an atmosphere of fear and degradation among teachers, and they're seeking to end secular education in favor of a version of Christianity that rejects science and centers America, a country formed thousands of years after the life of Christ and thousands of miles away from the his birthplace and ministry, as the only true place of God's favor. In their faith, Christianity tolerates and indeed encourages hatred and the dehumanization of LGBTQ people, while exalting the centering the lives of fetuses, who they call preborn people. Our political system is being dismantled. The voter suppression that I fought against since my first days as an assistant counsel at LDF in the late 1980s, and that remained rampant in the South, has now metastasized across the country since the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. New voter ID laws, burdens on absentee voting, voter purges, and other restrictions are now imposed in Montana and Wisconsin and Iowa. The new voter suppression laws not only seek to place barriers to make it harder for Black and Latino people to vote, but also to inhibit the ability of disabled voters. And they want to get rid of drop boxes. That's part of that agenda. And college voters to participate. Just a few weeks ago, a major GOP lawyer who heads the cynically named Election Integrity Network and who is part of Trump's legal team, Cleta Mitchell, insisted that conservatives have to work to remove ballot boxes from college campuses because students, she said, can just roll out of bed, vote, and then go back to bed, which is, of course, what we want. We also want them to go to class, but. And of course, gerrymandering, unconstrained by the preclearance requirements that were struck down by the Supreme Court in the Shelby case, which would have required certain jurisdictions to get permission from a federal authority before imposing new districting lines, maps, or other voting changes. And now further encouraged by the Supreme Court's decision that it cannot touch partisan gerrymandering, we are now seeing the end of representative democracy. We'll see in the coming 8 weeks whether the Supreme Court is even willing to strike down a clear racial gerrymander when they decide a case called Milligan versus Merrill, which is a challenge by LDF, the organization I was privileged to lead for 10 years, to Alabama's racist gerrymander. But as I wrote recently in a piece that appeared in Slate magazine, something even more fatal to our democracy is afoot. Across the country, Republican-controlled legislatures, having been allowed to gerrymander their way into supermajorities, are now dispensing with the relative niceties of voter suppression and passing laws that remove power from state elected officials who are Democrats. Now, when I use these party labels, I'm describing to you precisely what is happening in these states. I'm not saying that I favor one party or another, but it is Republican-controlled legislatures who are engaging in this practice to remove power from Democratic elected officials. You may be most familiar with this phenomenon in the context of efforts to remove powers from so-called progressive prosecutors in states around the country, and also efforts to remove power from the prosecutor, who's not even a progressive prosecutor, but she's Black, and apparently that means the same thing, to remove power from the prosecutor in Georgia to remove her ability to continue her likely, I think people fear, prosecution of President Trump and others for their activities after the 2020 election. But I think what many people may not realize is that this is happening on a much larger scale. Recently, Senator Mitch McConnell took a serious fall in Washington, D.C. His condition was unclear for a week, but he's fully recovered, and I'm very pleased about that. But if this serious fall had occurred to the ranking member of the Senate 5 years ago, the country would have been buzzing with speculation and anticipation. That's because in most states, including Kentucky, if a sitting senator could not complete their term in office and steps down or dies, the governor of the state is authorized to select a replacement to complete the term of the departing senator. And that new senator then runs to be elected to a full term. But there was no speculation about what might happen if McConnell's fall proved so serious that he was compelled to leave office. And that's because McConnell had anticipated this 3 years ago. In 2020, when he reportedly had some serious health issues, he began pressing the Republican-controlled Kentucky legislature to pass a law removing from the governor the power to appoint someone of the governor's choice to fill the unexpired term of a departing U.S. senator from Kentucky. You see, the governor of Kentucky is a very popular Democrat, Andy Beshear. So with McConnell's blessing, the Kentucky legislature passed a law removing this important power from the governor to exercise at his discretion. And now under the new law, the governor must select a nominee of the same party as the departing senator and can only choose from a list of potential nominees provided by the executive committee of the state party of the departing senator. Over in Wisconsin, the gerrymandered supermajority in the Republican legislature passed laws removing power from their Democratic governor, Tony Evers. And we're seeing this throughout the country. In other words, the new tactic is that if Democrats win election at the state level, a majority, supermajority, Republican-controlled legislature can simply strip the Democratic elected official of the powers of office, leaving that officer with a hollowed-out toolbox to advance the agenda for which they were elected by the voters. The spread of this tactic, which is only made possible by gerrymandered legislatures, is that if we don't stop this, elections won't matter. If a Republican wins, great. But if a Democrat wins in a state controlled by a Republican-dominated legislature, the official will be stripped of the powers of office and subject to the muscle of that legislature. It is, in my view, among the most dangerous phenomenon that is threatening our democracy at this moment. But it's not just about politics. There are other things that bring us to the existential crisis we now face. We have become inundated with and inured to violence. We sit here this week reeling from yet another mass shooting, this time in Allen, Texas. The perpetrator was, we now know, a rabid Nazi and gun extremist who planned the massacre for weeks. And we have lived through Uvalde and Buffalo and El Paso and Tree of Life, and on and on and on. Gun violence has saturated places like Baltimore City, where I live, with young people shot in broad daylight, sometimes outside their schools. And yes, Donald Trump happened. He did not create all of the problems that we face. He did not create racism. But he unleashed and gave permission to a particularly virulent and violent brand, and allowed, and in fact encouraged, millions of Americans to be their worst selves. What perhaps stuns many of us is the realization of how many Americans were apparently looking for the release that Trump provided. How many of our fellow countrymen and women appear to delight in the heady freedom of open racism, the intoxication of transgressing our taboos about misogyny, racist language and beliefs, about gay or transgender people, and breaking our hard-won social contracts. And so hate crimes are on the rise, reaching a peak in 2021. And those are only the ones that are reported. Anti-Asian violence, open anti-Semitism, and the steady murders of transgendered women have become daily news. And to top it off, our Supreme Court is now firmly in the hands of right-wing justices who appear to have decided to run the tables. and turn back long-standing precedent, striking down rights and guarantees upon which we have relied and come to expect. Rights and guarantees that might have forestalled our rapid democratic decline. Recent revelations about the court suggest that it is in an ethics scandal that does call into question the integrity of the court and its decision-making. And this is also part of the crisis we are facing. It's just astonishing, really, to be honest. And, 50 years ago, for sure, what we have learned over the last few weeks would have resulted in a resignation or two from the court. But those were in the days when integrity and ethics and shame still influenced how people behaved as public servants. Instead, now, some of our justices appear to have absorbed, or perhaps were always suited to the zeitgeist of this political moment, perfected by former President Trump. Never apologize, never concede that you did anything wrong, never sacrifice for the good of the institution if it will harm your stance of belligerence. You don't need to tell me that our media is broken in many ways, not just the faux media of propaganda arms like Fox News, but by the failure of too many mainstream publications, even the most respected news programs, to discern how easily they have been manipulated into following red herrings, climbing down rabbit holes when the fox's den is right there, pursuing dollars and clicks, and abdicating the essential and sacred role the media must play in a time of democratic crisis. We've suffered a crisis of the spirit. Over 1 million Americans have died from the COVID-19 pandemic and its related illnesses in just 3 years, and we've scarcely taken a moment to weep collectively for our lost loved ones, for the millions of orphans, for the babies without memories of parents, for the elderly who died alone, for the families who waited in hallways and in the streets outside hospitals, hoping to see loved ones they would never see again. It was and is a catastrophe of monumental scale. We must say these things. We must say these things. But we have been unable to muster a national response. We have no guide, no shared framework to unite us in collective national grief. A little over 50,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam over the course of a decade, and we spent years and years lamenting the bad choices and betrayals that led to our involvement in that conflict. We offer memorials to those who perished. We lost over 600,000 in the Civil War, and commemorative graveyards and archival readings and documents and monuments lament losses across the country. Over 3,000 people were lost on 9/11, and there's not a year when we do not commemorate the anniversary with solemn services and bells ringing and bagpipes and special services and moments of silence and news articles or films about the dead or about survivors. But 1 million Americans have been lost in 3 years to COVID, and we just keep it moving. And of course, the scourge of gun violence I mentioned earlier is a tragedy of monumental proportions, but it combines together in a uniquely American cocktail of white supremacy, untreated mental illness, misogyny, money in politics, and a gun culture that has come to take on a kind of religious worship and reverence, and that holds us hostage. We've watched the massacre of our children, little children, high school students, college students, young adults, and have decided as a country that we're powerless to stop it. And in those places where the population and its elected leaders are able to rouse themselves to rein in gun access, like here in New York, the Supreme Court has put a stop to those efforts with interpretations of the Second Amendment that suggest that its framers meant it to be a national suicide pact. So this is all very depressing. I know this, but I didn't create it. But in the words of James Baldwin, that which we do not face, we cannot change. And I know many of us are so exhausted by the strain of the last 7 or so years that we would prefer not to spend a great deal of time thinking about the full implications of what we are seeing around us. Our democracy is mortally wounded, and many of us are in denial about the fact that the prognosis is not good. I have said and will continue to say that the 2024 elections will be as consequential as any election in our lifetimes. Okay, shift. Because all of that is the bad news. But I really came tonight to talk about the good news. The good news for me, and I hope for you, is that if we make it out of this moment, the one confronting us over the next 18 months, we will be facing a chance that we have not had, certainly in my lifetime. A chance to build a truly healthy democracy. Indeed, I believe that right on the other side of this moment is the greatest opportunity I have seen for us to build the country, the democracy that I and perhaps you have dreamed of. Precisely because so much about what we have come to expect of our country is unraveling, precisely because the underbelly of our democracy has been exposed, because our politics have been boiled down to its bare skeleton, because the compromises we had grown accustomed to accepting no longer work, because of all of this, we have an opportunity to build a new America. I believe that this time of intense challenge, this period in which so much of what we have come to know is unraveling, is also a moment of rebirth. It is a rebirth we could easily squander if we fail to see that the starkness of this moment allows us finally to demand more and to be even more courageous. Because now we can see that the former ways have not been working. They have left our nation as a democracy, but one with tremendous vulnerability. I mean, let's be honest. It's not really possible for one man to walk in and just unravel a healthy democracy. The reason we are here is because we were not healthy. And yes, things have happened that have taken advantage of our weaknesses and our illnesses, but they were there. And now they've been exposed. So even though it's painful, I revel in the fact that this period is one that has, for me, produced the most honest and raw conversations about racial discrimination, about police violence, about gendered violence and misogyny. I spent decades trying to convince people that voter suppression even exists. And now everyone knows it exists. I endured countless conversations with so many people, many movers and shakers and captains of industry who insisted after 2008 that racism was over. Couldn't I see that we elected a black president? That we had a black attorney general? The loss of the right to bodily autonomy is not some abstract concept in a dystopian novel. It's real, as many of us predicted it would be. We watched a state pass a law, Texas, that would provide monetary awards to ordinary people, strangers and their lawyers, for reporting on women and others aiding in helping women obtain an abortion. And rather than strike down that law, we watched the Supreme Court allow the law to go into effect while it deliberated and wrote an opinion in another case, Dobbs, that would ultimately strike down the right to abortion. But let's not forget an existing, at that time, constitutional right, the right to abortion, on which tens of millions of Americans rely, was allowed to be burdened by the imposition of a bounty that would be paid to strangers who would report on those seeking to exercise that right. And we remained in that state in Texas for 9 months until the Dobbs decision. When we face this kind of threat, when we face this kind of lawlessness, it crystallizes for us the stakes of our inaction. And it should convict us, remind us that we have been failed by the appeasement and half measures and accommodations that have been so much a part of how we've approached our core democratic ideals for my lifetime. We will only save this country, repair the damage, and create a new, healthy, resilient democracy that can withstand attack and pressure if we are bold and uncompromising in our demand. So how do we do that? Let me offer to you 5 things that are guiding me as I prepare to return to the front, because I've been a little set back over the last year after stepping down from leading LDF. And it's given me a good opportunity to think about how to approach the fight that we're in and the moment that we're in. And so I'll just share with you some of the things I've been thinking about. First, I think it's really important that we recognize we have been here before. This country has died and been made over at least twice. The first time was with the Civil War. And after the Civil War, the passage of 3 amendments to our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment created birthright citizenship, which changed the entire face of this country. It was created to ensure citizenship for Black people, but the families of many of you in this room who are not Black were affected by this constitutional amendment that created birthright citizenship. And it ensured that you were entitled to due process in your states. And finally, used the word equal protection of laws that we are all entitled to. It did a lot of other things too, which I'm now also working on and writing about it. The 14th Amendment is actually a revelation. It was a reset for our country. And of course, the 15th Amendment said you cannot be kept from voting on account of race. And these 3 amendments were designed to create a new nation. They were designed to address the compromises that had been made by the original guys in the tricorn hats that everyone celebrates and calls the framers. And when we talk about the framers, we talk about Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and Washington. But we should also talk about the framers of the new America after the Civil War, Bingham and Sumner, and many of the others who were part of, and Frederick Douglass, who were part of the envisioning of a new nation in which equality and justice would be the standard, and in which something that existed nowhere else in the Western world, you could come to this country, become naturalized, and if your child was born in the country, from the moment your child was born in this country, be a citizen. That was huge. And they were explicit about who would have the power to protect these rights in those amendments. It says that Congress shall have the right to enforce these guarantees by appropriate legislation. That's how we ended up with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because the language of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments recognized we would not be able to trust states to do it, and said it will have to be federal legislation that will protect those rights. So that was an opportunity to reset the country. That opportunity was unfortunately stolen by white supremacist violence, by the Supreme Court, in a series of rulings culminating in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that turned its back on the promise of those amendments, and by Congress that sat on its hands for 60 years, and although authorized by those amendments, passed no civil rights laws until in the 20th century, until the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And so what was required then was a civil rights movement, which was the second time the country was recreated. And this is instructive for us, because the people who did it were not legislators. They were ordinary people. And in fact, they were people for whom America had not fulfilled its promise. Their names: Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton, Houston, Pauli Murray, Constance Baker Motley, Jack Greenberg, you know them. And you know what they did. And then, of course, John Lewis and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. These were people who still lived as second-class citizens in this country, and yet executed a vision of what it could look like if we lived up to the promise of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And what they did, their actions, are responsible for the lives of many of us in this room, and for why the world we live in looks like it does. And don't stare at me like, oh yeah, she's talking about Black people. I'm talking about all of you. They laid the foundation with their litigation and with their activism to allow women to do what women have been able to do, to allow you to marry who you wish to marry, to allow you to live in the neighborhood that you live in, to allow you to have access to the job that you are in. They created that. So we have to remember that because it is a reminder to us that it's not impossible to reset this thing. And that we have examples in the past that show us that it is possible. And we are the fruits of that. Second, we have to properly diagnose the source of the challenges we're facing so that we can see our own power. It's very fashionable for us to lament. Sometimes I hear people say, we just aren't strategic enough. The other side is so strategic. And we're just, we just give up. We just don't use our power. That's why they're winning, people say. But the truth is, what they are doing is a response to our winning. Everything they do is a response to the fact that we were able to reset the cultural, social, and political zeitgeist of this country. Why are they banning books? Why are they banning The Diary of Anne Frank? Why are they banning books about Rosa Parks? Why does the legislation that has been passed to effectuate these bans in Alabama and New Hampshire and Florida and Mississippi and all over the place, why does it ban books and materials that may cause feelings of shame, guilt, or discomfort on account of race? That's what the language says. I know that they say that it's all about pornography and grooming, but what the bills say are materials that may result in feelings of shame, guilt, or discomfort on account of race. Because they understand the power of empathy. They understand what happens when we unite arms with one another and feel one another's challenge and pain. And do you know when they saw it and how it really scared them into this latest craze? Was when we had tens of millions of people on the streets of this country in the midst of a global pandemic after seeing the George Floyd video. Largest civil rights demonstration ever in this country, multiracial, in all 50 states, and then around the world. It was empathy that drove people, even in this moment of health crisis, to say this cannot be. And the reaction it produced was an effort to try and interfere with that empathy. The voter suppression bills that we're seeing are responses to the resilience that we showed in 2020. Especially black people standing online in Fulton County for 9 hours to vote in the presidential primary, casting the last ballot in the Texas primary in 2020 at 1 a.m. That's why they passed laws that say you cannot give refreshments to people standing online to vote. They are responding to our resilience. And if we are not careful, we will not recognize our own power and we will stop doing the things that actually are effective. And so you hear people saying it now. What's the point of voting? We voted and now they're doing all these voter suppression laws. Yeah, we voted and it scared the bejesus out of them. This is not the time to stop doing the things. This is not the time to abandon empathy. This is not the time to not speak up when we see anti-Asian hate and violence, when we see the rise of anti-Semitism. This is not the time, because that's what they're reacting to. So remember and take account of our own power. Third, embrace more expert sources of information. And this is a good, important focus of my book. I'm writing a book now called Is This America? And the title is taken from the question asked by the great voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer when she appeared before the Democratic National Committee in 1964. She asked the question over and over. She was representing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who were demanding to be seated by the Credentials Committee because they were multiracial and had followed all of the rules to make a political party, and the regular Mississippi Democratic Party had excluded black people. And so she appeared before the Credentials Committee, and if you don't know who Fannie Lou Hamer is, she was an amazing activist, a simple woman who had been a sharecropper, Actually, if you don't know who she is, for heaven's sakes, get it together, okay? Google and find out who she is. But she asked over and over again, is this America? Is this America, she asked, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we get beaten by sheriffs just because we want to vote? Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our phones off the hook because we're threatened? Is this America? So it was a rhetorical question. And the reason why it's important to me is because the power of this ordinary woman, this sharecropper in that room asking that question, the implication was that this woman knows something about America that all of those people on the credentials committee packed into that room do not know. And that has been my experience over years representing those who live at the margins of our society. They are the true experts of what ails our democracy, not Jake Tapper, with all respect to Jake. We have to start recognizing the voices of expertise in this country. The people who know the most about our democracy are the people who meet it in its weakest places. And yet, we regularly ignore what they have to tell us about what is happening in this country. That's how so many of you can have seen videos of police officers killing unarmed black people and say, I didn't know. Because it's been a reality my whole life, and well before. But were those voices listened to? You heard Emily describe when I left law school, I worked for a year at the ACLU as a fellow. I was a fellow in the reproductive rights department where I worked on abortion rights. And one of the cases that I worked on was a case called Rust versus Sullivan, and it was challenging a law created by the Reagan administration, an executive order that forbids family planning clinics that receive public money from telling women patients that abortion even exists or that it's an option. This was in 1989, yeah. And so we ended up challenging the law. We took it to the Supreme Court, and we lost it. But my job, I was just a year out of law school, was to go around and gather information and get affidavits. And so I visited family planning clinics throughout New York and New Jersey and could hear from mostly young women how they use Planned Parenthood and how important it is to their health. And actually the doctor in the case, it was called Rust versus Sullivan, was my doctor, who worked at a Planned Parenthood clinic on the Lower East Side. And we said then that the rights that they are taking away, they will first take away from poor women and from Black and Latino women. But don't think it's not coming. And people said, no, no, no. You know, the right to privacy is, you know, inviolate, it's ensconced, it's connected to so many other rights. It won't happen. And yet, here we are. Are we listening to the right voices so that we understand where our democracy is weak? Fourth, very quickly, use what we're learning to restructure, look at our past and mine it for ideas, and recognize that people respond to passion and power and commitment. That's why my friend Justin Jones in Nashville and his colleagues Justin Pearson and Gloria Johnson so transfixed the nation when they faced expulsion from the Tennessee House. They were honest, they were prepared, they were uncompromising, they were passionate and dedicated. And now the Tennessee GOP is wishing they had never given these young men and that woman a platform. Here's the final one. It's a two-parter. Break eggs and pursue power. Break eggs means when you have the power, make transformative change. And we'll talk about this in the coming years, whether it's Senate reform or Supreme Court reform or political party reform or affordable housing or quality education or any of the things that we think are important to the maintenance of a strong democracy. We have to be prepared to break some eggs. We have to be prepared to step away from old orthodoxies and try new things and demand that we are ambitious and courageous in our effort to secure these rights. The second part, of course, is pursue power. I say this because very often progressive people demonstrate an aversion to the pursuit of power. It's like we think it's a bad word. We think it sounds kind of icky. It's like the man. And we worry about, the corruption of power. And power can corrupt, it can harm. But that is, in fact, the abuse of power. And so we have to stop being afraid to pursue power. The only way we're going to make change in this country is if we have power. I don't mean necessarily always the power that comes with political office, although I include that as well. But everywhere, we need our business leaders to reimagine how they use power and to what ends. Having power to give more money to your shareholders is simply not enough in a time of democratic crisis. But principally, I'm speaking about the broad array of powers that are available to all of us in this room, the power of our voice, of protest, of demonstration, of fierce scholarship or art that transforms our thinking and breaks walls, the power of a strength, a faith that deepens our humanity and has the power to restore and elevate our spirits as we work for democratic transformation. And yes, political power. But we must believe enough in our own integrity to trust ourselves with power, instead of walking away from power because we fear it. Trust our own integrity. Dr. Martin Luther King famously said that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best, Dr. King said, is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. We must pursue power for the purpose of implementing the demands of justice. And the justice that we seek must correct that which stands against love. I pray, I hope, I encourage, I exhort, I entreat you to join me and so many others who are committed to this fight, which I know we can win, but only if we engage the fight. Thank you. Thank you. Sit down. So I was told we have time for questions. Oh, these are good. Okay, let's see. Ooh, 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 ooh. Ooh, okay. Oh gosh, let's do the low-hanging fruit. How do you expect the Supreme Court to rule in the Harvard-UNC affirmative action cases? So one of the pieces I wrote in the New York Review of Books was about the oral argument in that case, and I hope you will read it. I keep begging, drop the paywall on that article, please. It's very important. Because I think that there's nothing that we have seen from the Supreme Court that suggests that they would be fearful of striking down affirmative action or even hesitate in terms of the 6 conservative justices. But the reason I wrote the piece in the New York Review of Books is because I think we don't understand, if they do strike down affirmative action in those 2 cases, how much they will actually be doing. And I mean that it's very nice to have a conversation about affirmative action in which one person has a hunch and another person has a hunch. You probably know how you feel about it, and we could have a conversation over dinner and whatever the feelings, and that's all legitimate and valid. But the great thing about litigation, which I love, is that you have to actually have facts and proof, which is fun. And so what's important to know is that there were trials in those cases. And when I was still director counsel at LDF, we participated in one of those trials and represented a diverse group of students. And those trials resulted in opinions from the federal court that was overseeing the trial. And those federal court judges wrote long opinions, over 100 pages in each case, both the UNC case and the Harvard case, finding that affirmative action as it's used in those schools, or at least I would say race-conscious admissions, so we know what we're talking about, did not violate the Constitution and does not violate the rights of Asian American applicants. It's not an opinion. It's actual factual data submitted to the court over weeks of a trial, exhibits, studies, expert witnesses, lay witnesses, reviewed by a judge, and an over 100-page decision. And then, in the Harvard case, that decision was upheld by the federal appellate court. The UNC case went straight to the Supreme Court. So we want to start with the fact that what the Supreme Court has are judgments by courts below saying, I know what you feel about affirmative. I know you feel some type of way. But that's not what's happening. And here's the decision that shows it. So understand, for them to do this, on these two cases and on this record, the Supreme Court would have to wipe that away. And that would be saying something very powerful and important in our legal system. Does it matter? I mean, I would like to know. I'm sure we have the board chair, co-chair of the LDF here with us today, and just as a matter of resources, we'd like to know, do trials still matter? Should we be spending money on expert witnesses? Should we be presenting exhibits? Or is it just something cute to do until it gets to the Supreme Court and then they do whatever they want? I think lawyers all over would like to know that. I'm sure law firms would like to know whether they should be expending money trying cases. So that's really important. And if you read the piece, because I'm sure they're going to drop the paywall on that piece and post it tomorrow, you will have a sense of the oral argument, which lasted for 5 hours. I've never seen an oral argument that long in the Supreme Court. And it's important for you to know what that conversation was, because it also revealed, how weak the position of the conservatives are. There are some amazingly powerful interventions from Justice Kagan and from Justice Brown Jackson and Justice Sotomayor about our democracy and about inclusivity and representation. And you don't see anybody writing about the argument, but it matters that for 5 hours, that was the conversation. So read the article, and we'll see what the court is going to do. I'm always eternally optimistic, but only because if they do not strike it down, it's not because they don't want to. It would be because they'd have to do all these things I'm talking about in order to do it, which will be quite important. So we will see. Okay, should we eliminate the Electoral College as it exists today? I mean, y'all are coming with the stuff. So this is another one where, there were extraordinary Black scholars, as I recall, who were writing very early on about this and were dismissed as fanatics. I think maybe even Terry wrote about this. Used to teach it at, did teach at Fordham? Yeah, Terry Smith, I was going to say that. The late Terry Smith, brilliant, and he was marginalized by so many people. Said, this is crazy, and now this is like a real conversation, and people are asking this question in the New York Public Library. So, again, which voices are we listening to? So the Electoral College is one of those things that are in the original Constitution that was designed to, I'm going to give it its most charitable explanation, to compromise, right, between the fact that you have more populous states that had big cities, and then you had states that were more rural, and to try to create some way of ensuring kind of a representation that would not simply allow the most populous states to run everything, right? Like this would be like New York, California, and Texas would just run everything, right? If we didn't create some ways, some dynamics, it's the same reason why we have 2 senators from every state, right? Even though some states are much bigger than others. I mean, Joe Manchin was elected with 429,000 voters, which is like not even Queens, right? So So there are a lot of compromises in that original Constitution. Obviously, there are some truly grotesque ones, like the 3/5 compromise, in which every enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person to provide representation to the South, but not to kind of humanize by providing a real person, citizen count. So should we eliminate the Electoral College that exists today? When I said break eggs, we are right at the moment when we should be re-examining all of this. I'm about to embark on a project looking at Senate reform. I'm on a task force with the ABA looking at Supreme Court reform. Like, when your stuff's not working, it's time to look and try to figure out another way, right? The only caution I would give you is that there are many people who write about the need for new constitutional amendments. I am extremely nervous about reopening the Constitution at this moment in our country. Some really bad things could happen in terms of constitutional amendments. We shouldn't assume. And so that worries me. That's the first thing. The second thing that bothers me is that this is the way we conduct law. You know, we're talking about all these new things that we need in the Constitution when we don't even use the stuff that's there. And so this project on the 14th Amendment that I'm getting ready to launch is really about that. The 14th Amendment is chock full of stuff. The 14th Amendment says, let me give you a preview. The 14th Amendment says that if states do not, if they interfere with the ability of black men at that time, this is before 1920, obviously. This is in 1868. So theoretically, people have the right to vote, but it's just black men. That states that interfere with the ability of black men to vote shall have their representation reduced by the amount of people that they are disenfranchising. It's just sitting there. It's just sitting there in the 14th Amendment, just like, why do you think those people said that? They had actually faced down insurrectionists. They actually understood. They understood what white supremacy was. And they included a punishment clause. That is the amendment that says that those who participate in insurrection cannot serve in the federal or state government. Are we using that one? No. Right? So the first question I have before I get into, you know, which elements of the constitutional infrastructure we should amend or try to amend or change is, are we using the stuff that is there and available to us? Are we using, as my friend Tom Saenz, the executive director of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, would say, are we using the whole Constitution? Because there's only 2 amendments that it appears ordinary people in this country know about, and that is the first and the second. But there's like 27. They're kind of important. And I'm just telling you stuff about the 14th Amendment that you know you didn't know, right? And it's like the 14th Amendment is the one that reshaped what we expect of this country emanates from the 14th Amendment. So there's a lot we're not using, and so my answer to that question is, to all of the questions about constitutional changes, is to first make sure that we need to, second, be very sober about what it means to have a constitutional convention at a time of this kind of fracture, rise of white supremacy, political violence. We have a lot going on. I don't know that we're grown up enough for a constitutional convention. Okay. How do we create accountability for, SCOTUS? You know, I actually have been writing about this for a while, and I actually believe it is possible. The first thing is to recognize that our Supreme Court exists as a part of our democracy, not above it. So it's not like sitting over the democracy proclaiming about it. It is part of the infrastructure. There are 3 branches of government. And the Supreme Court is the only Article 3 court actually identified in the Constitution. So that's number 1. Number 2, recognize that Congress does have an array of powers that it can use in relation to the Supreme Court. Congress makes a decision about how many justices there are. They could just pass a statute. Congress decides how justices are paid and what their allocations are for clerks and all the stuff they need, right? And that's important. Congress decides what the jurisdiction of the court is, right? What kind of cases they can hear. So Congress has power. And again, this is one of those things that you got to use it or lose it, right? So people want to say, well, let's do all of this stuff, but we also have to recognize, and Congress has to be prepared to use the powers that it has. I do believe that the Supreme Court must be bound by an ethics code, the same one that binds every other federal judge. It is impossible to imagine that your highest court, and there's no, certainly Western democracy where the highest court doesn't have ethics responsibilities. Saying that, the argument is, well, who would enforce it? Which almost kind of like begs the question. It's like you're saying, unless we have like Supreme Court police that would enforce it, you're not gonna do what you're supposed to do. So we need to create an infrastructure that is stronger than the one we have now and that really holds justices to account. This is part of their public job. The Supreme Court said in 1954, justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. It has long been recognized that the appearance of bias is almost as bad as bias in your decision maker. That's why we do jury voir dires, and like, we understand that when you have a decision maker in a legal proceeding, they have to be impartial. And you can only figure out whether they are by getting some information from them about what they're doing. Those of us who serve on boards, we fill out conflict of interest disclosures. We all have to do this stuff. It's not that onerous. So can the Supreme Court be held to account? Yes, they can. Can you expand the Supreme Court? Yes, you can. One mother caution on that. For me, the ethics code comes first. I'm not interested in a bigger Supreme Court that also doesn't have an ethics code. It's not like I'm saying, well, I'm upset about Clarence Thomas going on vacations with Harlan Crow, but I'm okay if Elena Kagan goes on vacations with Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know, right? I mean, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying no. Okay, I'm saying that there have to be rules that prevent that kind of thing from happening. I'm not going to feel better because Justice Sotomayor is, having dinner with, Senator Leahy. Like, that's not what we want. We actually want to have a court that has integrity and that is not entangled in this way. So let's do the ethics code so that when we expand the court, we don't just have more justices who are going on junkets and having their kids' school paid for and somebody buying their mama house. That's not what we want. So that's what I'd say about that. Okay, I think we have to stop, but I'm going to just answer this one because I know this is hot. This is hot. Do you think cancel culture is preventing progressive change? So, cancel culture to me is like wokeism. It's like a set of words that are supposed to set things off and supposed to explain something, but people don't know what it means. If we mean people who are who say certain things or do certain things, and many people, usually on social media, say things in opposition to them, I don't consider that cancel culture. Most of those people still have their jobs. People just aren't really canceled, to be honest. And also, when people write about being canceled from their op-ed in the New York Times, I have a problem with it. Yes, we are all being challenged. We're supposed to be challenged. It's not fun. I stood before a class for 20 years teaching con law, and I got challenged all the time. It wasn't fun. But that's what intellectual debate is about. We're also facing shifts in our country. Young people have different ideas about how we are supposed to live, and we're supposed to respect that. We don't even have to agree with it. I always remind people, because they ask me this, and within the civil rights context, how do you feel about young activists who are doing whatever, laying down on subway track or whatever? I remind them that my, I can't even call Thurgood Marshall my predecessor, the great Thurgood Marshall who led the Legal Defense Fund, and Jack Greenberg and all the other lawyers who were there. In the years after Brown, were working incredibly hard on implementing Brown, and they had hundreds, literally 500 deseg cases, recalcitrant southern jurisdictions pushing back, not wanting to desegregate. And then this woman decided not to give up her seat on a bus. And in Montgomery, and Fred Gray called Thurgood Marshall, and we got involved in that case, and then this movement was happening. And even though you don't hear a lot about it, LDF was, represented Martin Luther King in all of his, various campaigns. It was an LDF lawyer who smuggled out the letter from a Birmingham jail. We represented Rosa Parks, all of this stuff. And I will tell you that sometimes the leadership at LDF was kind of annoyed. Constance Baker Motley would have like 1 million trials, and then it'd be like, no, you got to go get Dr. King. He was just arrested. He's in a jail in Albany, Georgia. And she'd be like, did he tell me that he was going to get arrested? But then she would go and she would work to get him out of jail, right? So they were the older people, and John Lewis and Dr. King, they were the young people. Dr. King was 26, Montgomery bus boycott, right? And they too were annoyed. But you know what they did? They showed up to get him out of jail. And they represented the Selma Marchers, right? And they represented the Freedom Riders. And I think we have to figure out how to coexist. Change happens with the entire ecosystem. I won't let young people throw me out, because you need older people who have experience and understand how the pieces fit together and can see the infrastructure. And you need young people who are smart, who are bold, and who are impatient. That's what they bring to the table. They're impatient. And we need to stop suggesting that somehow is inhibiting our ability to say, maybe the things you were saying were wrong, maybe they're not nice, maybe they need to be said better, maybe you should think about it again. Maybe just be quiet for a minute. It's a tough time for us to be making it as though we figured the whole thing out. I'm really embarrassed most of the time for our generation. So it's a really tough time for us to be saying, and young people are drowning out our voices, and young people are pissed, in case you don't know. They are pissed, and they have every right to be. They're living in their parents' house. They're seeing a country that we screwed up. They're seeing a world that is disintegrating with climate change that we pretend we can't do anything about. They grew up doing mass shooter drills from the time they were 5 and 6 years old. Columbine was in, 1998? 1999? I mean, it's embarrassing. We should be embarrassed rather than telling them what they can't say. I would shout us down if I were them. So, I know what you mean by the question. I know what you mean, and we do have to find ways to talk, and sometimes their tactics are not great. And I've had that experience of people shouting at me. I don't enjoy it, and I don't think it's great. I don't think it's productive when we can't have a conversation, but I'm also not going to condemn them for it. They're using what tools they have to express passionately what they feel. And what we said we wanted them to do was exactly that. What we said was, these kids these days, they just don't care what's going on. They don't vote. They don't, they don't participate. They don't march. And then when they started marching, the people got mad because we didn't like how they marched. See, when Dr. King marched, what he did was he walked on this side of the street. We don't get to tell them how to, but that's what we said. We told them to vote. Okay, so they voted, and now they're like, we don't like your leaders. We want you to change seniority in the House. We want this caucus. That we asked them to vote. That's what's part of it. It's not just to go do what you say and pull a lever. is to question the whole thing. They want to make sure their vote counts. Maybe we've been asleep at the switch, voting for candidates we don't even know. You know when you voted for those 3 judges, pick 3, you didn't know who they were. You didn't know who the sheriff was, and it turns out now it's the sheriffs who've gone rogue, these crazy constitutional sheriffs who say they are the only law enforcement in the country and feel they can take ballot boxes and stuff. That's on us. We were just pulling levers. And if it had a D or an R next to it, we would just, of course we knew who the president was, of course the governor, of course the mayor, sure the senator. But tax commission, public service commission, railroad commission, you don't know what those are, you're just voting. But then you want to tell young people about how they're voting. So I think we have to, we're in a reckoning moment. You know, young people did something that we hadn't been able to do in 100 years. They pulled down statues of Confederate monuments. Something that was part of the landscape of this country and that most people didn't even understand where it came from. They actually thought that these, you know, were erected right after the Civil War, and when they were not. They were part of a campaign in the early part of the 20th century to reimagine what that war was about and who were the people who were noble and who were the people who were not. And they understood that what you place in the public square and exalt above says what you value. And they made them heavy and huge so that you would feel you couldn't come against it. But it was those young people who you don't like to see spray painting stuff and who finally did what we were unable to do, which is pull down these monuments to insurrection and to white supremacy. So I'm feeling young people right now. I don't always, like I said, I don't always like it. My daughter gives me a hard time. But I have to listen to her because she's smart. And she's concerned, she's speaking out of passion. So no, I don't think cancel culture is preventing progressive change. Thank you.